Good morning and welcome to Happy Hour with me, Eileen Cook. It is May 29th, Wednesday morning, and we are going to be talking actually about showing and telling an emotion on the page. And I want to give a big call out and thanks to Jenny, who was willing to volunteer her pages for this. So much, much appreciated. And a good reminder for other people, if you are interested in dealing with that, either as Alyssa did a couple weeks ago, where we talked about character and sort of used her character, Sagaris, as sort of an example. Jenny volunteered this time. So if you have a particular issue you're struggling on, I think sometimes practical examples work best. So it's kind of nice to see practicality. Show of hands, how many people had a chance to read the opening pages? Yay. Okay. So it's like, I like Bonnie's hand comes in from the corner. Just from out the outside. So that'll be good. So what you'll see is this is told in rotating points of view. And I wonder, Jenny, if you can just start us off, but tell us sort of what inspired this book, because I know, but others may not, and then why you're doing kind of rotating points of view.
So this actually started before I even knew I wanted to be a writer. So back in the 90s, I went on a business trip to San Francisco and we visited the Winchester Mystery House. And if you haven't heard of it, it's this crazy house that has all of these weird architectural features where there are staircases that end in ceilings and windows that open onto chimneys and doors that open onto the second floor air and just windows in the floors and just a lot of really weird things. And the mystery is, or the legend is, that Sarah Winchester, who was the wealthiest woman in the country in the late 1800s, she was the heir to the Winchester rifle fortune, that she had been advised by a medium that if she wanted to, that she was being haunted by the spirits of the people killed by the Winchester rifle, and that if she wanted to avoid having something horrible happen to her, that she needed to build 24/7 for the rest of her life. So that's the legend. But when I toured the house, like, I was living in a 100-year-old house where we would find all kinds of weird things. And so I kept saying to my boss, I don't think she was crazy. This all makes sense to me. And of course it's all very weird. But so I've always sort of like been fascinated by her and read and collected stuff. And so when I decided to come back to writing after my divorce and relaunching of my other career and not having time, I decided to start with something easy, ha ha ha, and picked up writing this book. So the question is, was Sarah crazy, or were there reasons for what she did? And so the secondary point of view, first of all, creates a framing story for anybody who doesn't know the story of the house. So if you pick up the book and you don't know the story of the house, you need to somehow find out all this weirdness so that you understand what the question is as you're going through the book. And then I also needed her at the end because Sarah actually dies in her 80s before the end of the book. And so somebody needs to be there to really show whether or not Sarah ultimately accomplished her goal, which doesn't really happen until after she dies.
Okay. So when the book opens, do we open with Sarah's point of view or Henrietta's?
Henrietta's. There is like a really short prologue at the very, very beginning, but it's like 3 paragraphs and it's from Sarah's point of view.
Okay. And you have shown this off in a few different writing venues and have gotten the feedback that it's too much telling.
Yes.
In those opening pages.
Yes.
All right. And I have to let people know, I asked Jenny, I know she's been working on this, to actually submit the rough draft versus anything that she has worked on since, so we can sort of see that. So thank you for that, because I know that's a huge vulnerability because it's like, but I've changed stuff, so I want to look at that instead. But I asked her to submit the rough draft. So for people that have read it, and it is, again, so if you want to read it, is in the all TCA members, I am going to put up the first pages from Henrietta. Did anyone have any thoughts when they read those pages? Everyone's going to be quiet. Go ahead, Alyssa.
Some of it felt like a distant point of view. I think, what was one thing I highlighted? Like there was a sentence where you said, a cool breeze rustled Henrietta's skirt, sending a chill through her. Whereas if you change that to something like Henrietta shivered as a cool breeze rustled her skirt, then it's a bit more in her instead of something happening to her. Right. I think there was a couple examples where it felt like external things were happening to the character. And like even things like the car was driven by her granddaughter instead of her granddaughter drove the car. Those sort of things. And it also can also tighten up your word count and make things happen a bit quicker. That was something I kind of picked up.
Yep, that's what I'm
And the was driven is an example of passive voice. So people have maybe heard about that. So instead of saying, yeah, the car was driven by someone, the car, so-and-so drove the car, makes it a more active choice. So that is a thing to consider. Bonnie, you had a comment on Henrietta's pages?
Yeah, just more that I never got a chance to really get grounded in the character because we kept changing. So I was like, okay, here we are, she's there. And then, oh, we're having a thought about her grandmother. And then we're having a thought about the house. And then we're having a history of her. And it was like, if you just settled on one thing or maybe two things, then I would have felt like, oh, I'm really into Henrietta. But because it jumped around so much, that might be why you're getting the showing, don't telling. All the information was important, but it was too much, too fast, and I just didn't feel like I was, when you talk to someone and they keep changing the subject, that's kind of what it felt like. You're like, wait, I was interested in that subject, don't change it. So I think that might be contributing, but that's an easy fix. You can just expand it all. Yay!
Bonnie's favorite thing to do, write more.
Write more.
And I think that's interesting because I was listening as you were talking, and it's clear to me your fascination with, I just blanked on her name, Mrs. Winchester, Sarah, on her point of view. And you talked about Henrietta as a frame and that, well, it's her job to give you the history of the house. But of course, Henrietta doesn't know that. Like, she thinks she has her own story. And there are hints of that in this chapter. But thinking about, and this might be just some pressure you feel around, how much do I have to tell the reader right at the get-go? And kind of backing up and thinking, what is it that the reader needs to know both about Henrietta for this story, which is equally as important as what do they need to know about the house? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to share a screen here. So hang on. So just a few things. So one, I loved the scent of over-ripened apricots, just because, just in terms of tone, I think you're setting up a sense of rot, which I think is probably going to be important, which is important. So I highlighted various things where I thought you were kind of hinting at emotions and feelings, and so we could kind of talk about those. So the car, driven cheerily by, versus, again, we're going to switch that. Her perky granddaughter Rose drove the car, making the turn into the driveway. It hit her. The smell, the sights, the memories. It was as if she had arrived yesterday, frightened, proud, and determined, with 1 year Andrew in tow. So one of the things is, I think, as maybe Bonnie was hinting at, I'm wanting to know more of this history a little bit. And so this was a nice hint at, this is a place that she is returning to. And it's very, I don't know, have you read Kate Morton?
Yeah, we had this conversation. Her stories always sound fascinating to me. Like, I've bought 3 or 4 of them, and then I never get through them. I never get to the end.
I love Kate Morton. If other people like that kind of one time frame, another time frame, that is 100% what she does.
Right.
And it is often an older person who's arriving back at some mystery that happened in the past. So I think that is something to think at. Then we have Henrietta sat looking up at the house, wishing she could turn around. Some memories should be left to the past undisturbed. So I think some of this is thinking about how do we show that she's feeling those things versus necessarily telling us that she's feeling those things. So that I think is going to be something to think about. So there's something in the chat window, but it won't show me what it is here. Maybe it will.
It's Elisa being confused. She thought Henrietta was watching the car, not in the car.
Ah, there you go. See, I actually got that to open up too. So that was one that I sort of pulled at. And I do think you do see that the difference. So Ruth is swiftly pulling into the parking space. She's really ready to go. And I think, we're getting a little bit of reluctance to do that. So Andrew's her son. He was never curious about the past. But I think we're getting a lot of information in here, and I'm not sure we're going to need necessarily all of this at this point. And I'm a little curious around why they're going to the house at this time.
Yeah, in the rewrite, her granddaughter just got a job as a sort of human interest reporter for the local paper, and this is her first assignment, is to write about the house.
And there's a family connection to the house. I think that will ground a little bit, because part of me is, why are they going here now? And especially if she's not reluctant. So that also sets up a dichotomy for her, because she wants, I'm suspecting, to help her granddaughter. This is her granddaughter's first big job assignment kind of thing. And that creates a thing of, she doesn't want to be at this house. There's some things that she's not going to want to confront. Is this modern? I should, hang on, scrolling back.
It's the 40s.
1940s. Okay, so she's going to have known Sarah Winchester. So you might just, and again, I think it's because we need to be really firmly grounded in the 40s, maybe talking about like what the car is, or a little bit about what they're wearing, just so that we're very clear that the Henrietta story is the 1940s versus that. Marianne also put her finger on when we use words like felt, thought, heard, you take us one step back, which I think contributes to the feeling that Alyssa was having around this idea. Instead of saying, I felt angry, Henrietta, she is angry. Like, what is happening for her, versus putting the felt in there, or putting her thoughts just in italics versus separating them out. We'll do all of that.
Perhaps by describing what the granddaughter is wearing, you can kind of ground us in the time, and also give a little bit of opinion on what she's wearing. I don't know if you could have some newfangled trouser suit, or I don't know, something that might be something that would ground us a bit and give us an idea of how to picture the granddaughter.
And 1946, so this would be, the war is just over, correct? So it might be thinking about, this, so Ruth is kind of this vanguard of maybe women who plan to stay in the work field even after the boys have come home, so to speak. So that would have been a change. So sort of thinking about that, or if it's odd to see young men back, like, so some of that, again, I think is going to be, for me, whenever I read a historical, is wanting to feel grounded in that time. So even the fact that Ruth is driving might feel like very like, well, my granddaughter's driving, right? Like, and she might think of, Queen Elizabeth driving the ambulance in the UK, or like, do you know what I mean? Like, I think in the 40s, like, you were just seeing the kind of shift of the role of women had. And given that this is a woman's story, I think that's kind of an interesting thing to play with that.
Well, and yeah, that's a really good point, because when you look at Sarah's first chapter, her first thing is she wanted to work and was kind of poo-pooed.
Yeah. So I think you're setting up some interesting thing about the role of women and, what women do, what women had to do, because I also have the sense that Henrietta had to work. And I think we often think of, again, when we think of this shift, like, well, women, had the opportunity to go back to work when the men were away. But for some women, that was never much of an opportunity. It was what had to happen in order to kind of keep that in line. But again, it was a kind of another fundamental shift, I think, in the role of women in the home and in the work environment. And again, Ruth is, I have the sense, working because this is something that she loves to do, which is different. So there's this, kind of little, once again, Henrietta put her faith in the future and walked into the unknown. I think you're setting up some interesting mystery, and I'm okay that we don't know those things. That works as sort of an intriguing. So we're again to getting the house. And again, I think you're creating tone. So there's shadows, there's eerie shadows. Notice there's an echo there. You'll want to fix that one. Shadows and then eerie shadows across the front lawn. Here's that example, the sending a chill through her, having her experience that chill in real time. And here's some of the things Marianne was talking about, thoughts. And am I locking up? Damn you, internet. Let's turn off other things. See if that will help. Maybe there were spirits here, the spirits of those who had built, lived, and died here, the memories of love, laughter, heartache, and loss. So I'm liking a lot of this, but just to be aware that, again, I think we have that distance feel. But I do like this, like Ruth dragged her up the front steps. That's telling me her reluctance without saying she felt reluctant to go inside. So I think that's a nice example of showing right there, where we have that they drag her up the front steps, which of course they didn't really, but we know what you mean with that. The man behind the ticket counter could have been William Wirt Winchester himself. And then keep in mind you have an echo here again. Could be the man himself, but again, those are small things. Only William Chester never lived here, at least not when he was alive. So I like that when he was not alive, because I think that's, again, a nice kind of hint at some ghostly things that may be going on. But actually for myself, this is where I bumped and I went back to the beginning the first time I read it, because for whatever reason, I was assuming this was present day. And I was thinking, how would she know what Walt Winchester had looked like? Like, I hadn't realized, like, oh, she would have been around as a young person when Sarah still lived in this house.
Yeah. She actually wouldn't have known him, though. She would have only seen him from a picture, but yeah.
He would have died beforehand. But you know what I mean? Like, it was just reminding, because, again, I was thinking modern times, still wouldn't have been around, right?
That's good.
Through any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add a comment?
Yes, please.
Because I have not read any of this, so it's all kind of hitting me at once, but where it just suddenly drew me in was when Ruth is asking all these questions. And to jump in at the beginning, to have her asking these questions like, my God, what happened here? Well, was it haunted? Like, to me, that was it haunted is such a powerful question, and something that this sort of journalist type young woman would ask. And so that drew me right in. All the stuff before, although interesting, I think can be woven in. And then when you get to the lines where she thought this and she thought that, to me, those seem like questions a journalist would ask. So again, I'm sort of thinking, perhaps it could be this sort of diatribe from Ruth, all these questions, and that Henrietta said, oh my God, like, you're sounding like a journalist. So then we know that is what's kind of being set up for us as well. Because I would imagine that this Ruth would ask all these questions and throw out all this information so that it's out there in conversation rather than just in the head. Just a thought.
And dialogue is a great way to kind of get some of those things out, particularly then if you're contrasting dialogue with what she might be thinking inside. So for example, this section here, it was this of Miss Winchester herself was standing behind her asking why Henrietta was here. Why had she come back against the advice the old woman had given her with her nearly dying breath? So you can imagine, like, if Ruth says something like, you must be so excited to be back, that kind of thing, where then we see her internal thought, like, but I told her I would never come back, blah, blah. And then we see her, again, we'll have a little bit more conflict in this scene, which will also kind of tighten things up, where she doesn't want to be here and she feels like she needs to be here for her granddaughter. That will help you kind of go into some of that. And again, I followed this because just to show you that there's a lot of things where you're telling us what she feels. She could feel it already. This was a mistake. And again, you're telling us, I was going to say showing, wrong word choice. You're telling us in that moment what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested to that. So I do like this. Yes, 2 tickets for the candlelight tour. Like, I am intrigued with that. So what to do is overall, I think there's places to tighten. So looking, for example, Alyssa mentioned in the chat window, like shadows were beginning to fall, could be the shadows lengthened. Some of those kind of just tiny tightens of things will kind of bring it up. You know, making sure to avoid the passive voice would be something that would help. And then thinking about, you know, maybe Ruth is firing off questions as they're pulling in, or some of those kinds of things, right? So, because she doesn't really answer some of these.
Right.
Is it true? Is it haunted? Did she talk to spirits? What was it like to live here? We never get her kind of response to that. And I think, you know, as Christy points out, having some dialogue there would sort of add to that. Okay. Other thoughts from people?
Just on the subject of Q&A, Henrietta could answer Ruth's question in her mind in prose, but then, you know, more truthfully, but then give her a more couched or evasive answer in dialogue. And then that would set up a conflict between what she feels and what she's willing to, you know, acknowledge. You know what I mean by that?
Well, for example, and I'm going to pick one that I think would be interesting because I think the haunted one is interesting. So if she said something like, is it haunted? And have her be like, you know, Ruth, baby, you know, was I ever one to tell you ghost stories? Do you think your grandmother believed in that kind of thing? And then her internal thought is like, there's no way to explain the dead and how they tend to linger to someone who's so alive as Ruth. Or something where she's having a thing where, like, she's not, I spent my whole life wanting to save my children from this kind of scary thing and how the dead can linger, or, you know, whatever her thought is about haunting. Or maybe she says something like, oh, you know, haunting's how they sell tickets. It makes things fun. But maybe it actually makes her angry that people talk that way, or it's just a way of being dismissive.
Or like disrespectful to the spirits of the dead, or if she takes that more seriously.
Yeah, and again, I think this is interesting to think about the impact of the war. So for people who are thinking about this, Sarah Winchester and the mediums were really quite big because of what had happened in the Civil War, which is there had been kind of an unprecedented number of deaths that had happened. So you're talking about millions of, you know, people who had been killed on the battlefields in the Civil War. And you were seeing, you know, people wanting to reach out to the dead, which is what kind of brought up mediums in this really popular sense. And Sarah feeling potentially haunted because the Winchester rifle was one of the first kind of modern day weapons that allowed people to shoot much quicker. So that's why the devastation was much worse than versus when you either had to load a muzzle kind of thing, right? Like that takes a certain amount of time. You have to be like, the aim wasn't particularly great with all those things. And with the Winchester rifle, what you saw is that kind of immediate thing. And then if you also kind of flash forward and realize World War II would have been horrific. And I don't actually know when Hiroshima was, but I don't know if she would have any thoughts about, you know, like, is that person, like, if she's got ghosts, what does that person have to deal with? Or any of those kinds of things. I also like that Bonnie made these questions more personal. So, you know, instead of, is the house haunted? Was it haunted when you lived here? Did you ever see a ghost? Because again, that requires more personal reflection versus just sort of espousing on the house in general. I like that. Alyssa?
The other way that you could kind of show her reluctance is kind of maybe slow down her not getting out of the car and have her saying one thing and thinking another, like her telling her grandkid, oh, I just need a moment, my legs are feeling heavy, or some sort of like...
Yeah, well, like, she's catching her breath and...
Yeah, but internally she's like, do I really want to go here? Or like she's making excuses or something like that, where it's like she's saying one thing but thinking a different thing, and then you can kind of see the conflict. I don't know.
Well, I think that would be interesting. She probably talked herself into like she had maybe tried to talk Ruth out of going with her. Ruth has kind of, you know, talked her into it, and she's agreed because she wants to help her granddaughter. But yeah, it might be something like, you know, this is too far of a trip for me. You know, it's awful hot out today, or, you know, whatever that is. And then, you know, internally being like, I thought maybe I could do this, but now that I see this place, I don't know if I can go inside. Or, I mean, there might be an element of also being very attracted to go inside. Sometimes when we've stayed away from something for a long time, there is an element of...
Yeah, some sort of wave of sentimental emotions that she could feel upon pulling up in the drive and seeing the house for the first time in 40 whatever years. I mean, she's going to feel emotions, right? So put those in her body, give her that visceral reaction, and that will really pull the reader in and tighten up that narrative distance so that you know, can address those criticisms you received about distance from the people that read it. That's the kind of thing that makes it more immersive.
And also think when we talk about setting, and I think this is interesting, like this is a home that she had, you know, that she loved, that she actually raised part of her son in. And if you've ever had the experience of going back to a place that you used to live a long time ago and how it looks different.
It's always smaller.
Yeah. Or anything where it's like, now this place has become a commercial enterprise, right? Like I'm trying to imagine what it would be like to go back to my childhood home and that someone was selling tickets out front, like, you know, like, oh, come on in and see this, you know, classic home from the 1970s, you know, and we're all kind of making fun of the 1970s and check out the shag carpet. My mom had an actual rake. Oh, yes. Yes. She had a rake for the shag carpet, right? Like, and I can imagine, you know, someone setting up, you know, a 1970s house and how that would feel. Also, I wouldn't want anyone to be making fun of my home, right? Like it is a place that I loved. Or does she feel like it's weird because she's moved on, like she's an old woman, but this house probably hasn't moved on because it's been frozen in time, right? So they kept the decorations the same. Like how strange that would feel that you're completely, because I think that's what it is. Like, you know, when you go back to your elementary school and you remember thinking it was so far to walk to the cafeteria and you realize it really wasn't, is you have that awareness of how different you are. So if she's having any feels about how different, like that she used to skip up those stairs 1,000 times a day, hauling water or whatever. And now, you know, she's, I don't know how old she is, in her 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
that her knees creak and that she's having a hard time getting up and down those stairs. They hadn't been as steep before.
Yeah, those kinds of flash forward, flash back kind of memories. The other thing I wanted to add was that sometimes, especially older people, will see in their mind's eye a slightly different picture than the one that's before them. So there might have been some very personal detail that's now missing, that's been kind of sterilized or cleaned up for the museum, that maybe gives her a bit of a twinge, of melancholy or something that was on the porch or in the yard, or, like a rose bush has been removed, or something that had meaning to her when she was there as a younger woman and is now missing. So a kind of a ghostly memory of something that was important.
Or I think in terms of what makes a place a home, right? Like, was it that, the house always smelled of fresh baked bread because she baked bread first thing every morning. And now, of course, it smells like lemon furniture polish and, it's that thing where, maybe there was always a book on the porch because Miss Winchester liked to sit outside and read in the afternoons. And now, there's just a ticket booth or like that kind of thing where there's something that made it a home that is now no longer there because it isn't a home, right? This is a actual national park, I think.
Well, it's on the historic register, but it's not it's a tourist trap, but yeah.
Yeah. Right. And how strange that would be. So, all right. So I'm going to close this one for a second and then open. The other chapter comes from Sarah Winchester. And so we're in her, right? So one of the things I did is you opened the other chapter with the smell of rotting apricots. And I like that there was kind of a nice echo here. So it's earthly, moldy, chemical smell of death had followed her. So one, just kind of creepy. But two, I did like that there was kind of those echo between the two chapters. And again here, like just to be aware that like you're telling us what happened, but in Europe's museums and churches, cafes and countrysides, she'd found the fresh air she needed to heal and the intellectual stimulation she needed to come back alive. And I am going to put I'm not always against telling. Sometimes that's the most efficient way to get something out there, but I just wanted to highlight it as a time where you were kind of telling us exactly where she was. Before I go any further, people who read this ahead of time, did you have any thoughts on this one? Alyssa?
So I was engaged once she started arguing with the guy. So I don't know if you can pull that forward. So it opens with her standing outside the door. And then maybe you can put some of these bits in the scene with the conflict. But that's when I was engaged, was when she starts arguing with him. But also with the argument, and now I see the date. Okay, I was going to say, it felt like a lot later than, or earlier than 1946. But now I see the date and then see, okay, that was kind of the time period I was thinking from the conversation they were having. But yeah, they were talking about women having the vote on the board. And I guess they didn't have the right to vote for a government at the time, but I guess you could have a vote for a corporation at that time. Okay.
And because you're doing the time changes, thinking as much, again, as you can about how to maybe place this in our minds in terms of what people are wearing or anything like that will help cement for people what time period that they're in.
Yeah.
Will help them with that.
Just a swish of a long skirt or a bonnet ribbon, or it's something to take you back to an earlier time as she moves up.
And, again, you might, put in something around something in the paper, or I don't know, and this of course would have been a big thing at the time, what European fashions were like compared to US fashions at this time. Because if she's been over in Europe, maybe the skirts are narrower And she can see him looking at, like, he still wishes she was in a bell skirt, and, no one in Europe was wearing bell skirts anymore. And so he thinks she's coming back with fast ideas, or because of course war certainly changed fashions as well, because there would have been hardships and everything that would have been happening during that time period. Bonnie, did you have thoughts on these?
Yes, actually, I felt like you knew Sarah better than Henrietta. So there were times where you actually showed her feelings more than you did in the previous one, which I think might help guide you, because you can go, oh, how did I do it? I did it in here. There was some problems with, what's that called? Stage direction. She was outside the study, then she was outside the study, and then he was getting out of a chair, and I was like, wait, they were standing at a door. When did they get in chairs? So there's sometimes that can cause a little bit of a disconnect, and just if you show her moving through the space, obviously she's agitated, and that could be shown in she pulled the chair out and sat in it and sat very firm and stiff because this man is not listening to her and she's trying to make a point. But I really got more a sense of her character from this section than I did from the previous one.
And again, if we go back to when you were talking initially, your fascination comes with Sarah. Like, this is the person that inspired you to want to write the book. And that kind of comes through, is I felt much more grounded, and she felt like she had more purpose.
Right.
That was going on and what was driving her. Like, she has a clear goal in this scene, which is to make some decisions for his company. And she wants people to pay some blinking attention to what she's doing. So I think that makes a difference. I keep freezing up, don't I? Probably in horrible facial expressions. I just get a notice. It's like, your internet is unstable. All right, so I'm going to kind of go through that. So she's outside Thomas's study. She goes in. I did really quite like this line: cancer, just another form of wasting illness that forced those around you to watch you slowly die. She's had a lot, and if for people who don't know her history, she lost a child, possibly multiple miscarriages as well. Her husband has died, which I think is clear. Again, there was everything that had happened with the war, so there was all of those kinds of things going on. So she's been through a lot. And so, and here you have it. Her father, mother, her baby, her cherished father-in-law, and last, her dearest husband. But just being aware, like, she'd lost her purpose. She had no plan for life without him. Like, we're almost a little distance from that. Like, I almost want to feel like, was she getting up and she would just wander around the house? And this might be where going to Europe had kind of re-given her that purpose. So taking it from the top and maybe inserting it more in here, that it was there that she kind of refound her way around. I like this. Childless, just like her sister Mary, she wanted something more than her name on a tombstone. That's a very clear setting up of a goal. She wants to do something that matters. She wants to have a life that matters. And if it's not going to be having children, then by God, by golly, she's going to find something else. She doesn't yet know necessarily what it is. At this initial point, she's thinking she wants to run the company or to have, certainly a larger role within the company. But it's clear that she's not going to be happy just meandering through the rest of her life. So she's still outside the study door. Again, do keep in mind, Bonnie, who mentioned the stage directions, like, take a look at some of that. I think this is a great feeling. So her brother-in-law and Jenny had moved into the house that she and William had designed and built. She felt as if Thomas and Jenny had stepped into the life she and William should have lived, and she was now adrift. I really like that emotion a lot, because I think it's really, so I might spend some time and kind of show how disconcerting that is. And you do have moments of that, because they've kept some of the things the same and changed other things, if that makes sense. She talks about she's missing William and what they did together. She closed her eyes and savored the touch of his warm hands on her face. How soft your skin, and it's pale like ivory. He was so close she could almost smell him, sweet tobacco and gun oil. That was a really nice moment, because I think it is that her flashing on what she felt was with him versus saying she thought about how she missed how he used to smell and feel. Like, we're just actually there. We're smelling him. We're feeling him. And that is a really good example. So when Bonnie says, here you have some times where you're showing it and really doing it, those would be the kind of thing. Because you could have easily have said, she thought about how it was when he would touch her gently and how she could, breathe him in. But here we are in that moment.
Take the word almost out. So that in her memory, she does smell. Because,
he was so close, she could smell him.
Yeah, she could smell him, because sound and smell have the most powerful link to memory.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I wanted
So
to
make
add
it feel like something about the room itself actually brought that visceral memory back to her.
Bonnie?
I wanted to add that sometimes when we're drafting, we come up with a better way to say things, and you actually start this one with, she paused outside the study door, which is what she did in the previous section. And sometimes if you just rearrange things, move this one up before her, so she's getting the memory before she does the confrontation, and then you're like, oh, okay, this really means a lot to her. We've understood that this is something that brought her joy in her past life, and now things have changed. It's a way of showing it. For some reason, when we write it, we almost do it backwards, because we're trying to discover, oh, why is she so upset? Okay, here it is. And then when you revise, if you just switch them around, it's like magic. Because I feel like you have a lot of connection here, and if that was done before we know that she's preparing to confront him, then we're more connected to her, we're more invested in her.
Yeah. And I think part of it is just this whole idea about, like, how much do you cram into that first chapter? I wanted to show, like, all these people died. I wanted to show like, she has this love of like architecture and construction, goes off to build this big crazy house, which really was as big as Henrietta remembered. It was 160 rooms. So,
amazing.
Yeah. But,
and I think in terms of what to cram in, I think what's most important is that she has lost William and her focus. Even if it's just there have been so many other losses, I'm not sure that we necessarily need to know all of those in this opening chapter.
Okay.
I do want to give you kudos that one of the things that I really liked in terms of just setup is using physical space, which obviously physical space is going to be important in this book, is she's outside the door. And inside that room is the life that she wanted, and she's being kept from it. Like, she actually has to kind of knock on her own study door, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really nice thing. So then we meet Thomas, who I think every righteous woman is going to hate within moments, if you haven't read this. So Thomas is her brother-in-law. He's like, what can I do? And she says, I'm back. I want to come back to the office to take the role I had. And here's a good example. Remember in the other chapter where we wanted kind of what she said versus what she's thinking? I like that she's saying very brave things. I plan to come to the office to take up the role I had before William's death. But inside we see that she's shaking, right? Like, she's like, speak confidently, be demanding. Like, she knows what she needs to do, but it's not necessarily how she's feeling. So I think that's a good example that we could see in the scene with Henrietta, where there are some things that she may be saying, but we're seeing that it's not necessarily quite the same.
Okay.
You could almost reverse her internal dialogue with her actual dialogue.
Yeah.
So she's psyching herself up, and then we understand how hard she's trying to give this impression of confidence.
So then, Thomas the dick, because she clearly doesn't think much of him. And I think this is another example of where you're just a little bit more in her head. Like, Thomas never should have risen above secretary. Like, that's her perspective. And so you're giving us that versus many would have thought Thomas never would have gotten higher in the field. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, this is what she thinks. And I like that we're in her head with that. She can see him calculating his response, and she prepares herself for the fight to come. That might be a place to put, like, what does that feel like for her? Like, is she squaring her shoulders? Is she, forcing herself to keep her hands from shaking? What is she, like, she's girding herself for battle, for lack of a better term. So what is that? And again, since we're trying to show also costume, is there might be a way that she can, I think corsets were still a thing. So she can't maybe necessarily take a deep breath as she wants to, or but that might be a place where you can see her sort of tug at her longer skirt or something, again, that would give us a place where she is. This was another thing I like. So he invites her into basically her own study. He's taken over, and he sits behind the desk imported from France, and she knows that. She catalogs that without thought. When you talk about wanting to explain that she loves all this stuff with it, the fact that she notices that and she knows where it's from and she recognizes this is a piece that they own, I think is showing us that without telling us that.
Okay.
So he's like, basically, you have no business here. If it's about money, we can adjust your distribution. And she bristles, right? Which understandably, like, all of this was her. Make it sound like I could give you something. Allow me to be so kind. Like, no, asshole. This is my money. You're not giving me anything. Could be I'm just a little bitter on these issues these days anyway, but I resonated with this feeling where she is, this is what I have earned. This is not a favor you are doing to me. And she resents that. Here's another, she stated pulling herself up with pride. That was, I think, another nice beat where we're seeing her stiffen her spine. Like, she's got some resolve here. And I like that. Then she's sharing more of her plans. Like, she wants to think about the factory expansion, and she's done a study of the buildings in Europe. And he's like, basically poo-poos her, like, certainly you'd rather go, cut some flowers and all kind of things. And I think Alyssa's kind of like, this is where I was reading really quickly because I, of course, wanted to reach through and smack him. And I do think it is also the power of dialogue. And looking at the amount of dialogue you have in this scene as compared to the Henrietta scene, because that does move things along. And we see, again, internal thought as well as external thought. Just flagging here, again, you're telling us what she's thinking. This did throw me, like, Thomas, I can vote, because I was like, no, she can't. And I don't actually know, in the late 1800s, was the suffragette movement a thing yet?
No, she couldn't have voted in, like, elections. It's about voting on the board, so I need to make that clear.
Yeah.
Just take I can vote out and say, Thomas, with my shares in the company, I can vote. You don't have to repeat I can vote. Just explain it the other way around.
And, I hear Miss Colt's widow sits at the head of his board of directors. I liked that quite a bit. And then this, I just, like, again, I don't know why it threw me. Jenny can vote on the board. So can Mother Jane. Let's allow all the women to vote on boards in the government. But they could they vote on the board? Could Mother?
I think he's being kind of like, let's let, so it's obviously not clear, but it's like him being frustrated with, like, women's movement. Like, let's let the women vote. Let's let them do this. It's like that sort of bombastic kind of.
So I just wasn't clear. Like, maybe Jenny and Mother are on the board and they could vote as well. So I wasn't actually clear. Like, I could tell he was exasperated. Yeah. Alyssa, you had a comment?
maybe you can, so we don't know who Jenny or Mother Jane are, but maybe like, oh, well, maybe children should vote. Maybe zebras can vote, like something like that, where it's clear he's being
How
sarcastic.
absurd he thinks it is. Yeah.
I wish you'd just be satisfied with God's given separations. Every woman who doesn't want to punch him before this moment will now want to. Let men run the company. You stick to your lady activities or lady bits. I'm late for office. I see you get the silly notion out of your head, and since you appeared back to stay, find an activity to employ yourself, but not at the office. And this might be a place where he's giving her kind of the bum rush out of her own space is another place to kind of get to that feeling, which I think is great. Like she and William were running this company, and now he's replaced her. Like it's his office. He can show her the door in her own space, and how demeaning that must feel.
I was a little confused by the term "the office." Like, is he talking about going somewhere else?
Right. So this is the study in his home office. This is the study. And I've gotten that before too. So I obviously didn't clear it up enough, but this is like the study in the house, like his home office. And now he's going to go to like the work offices. You know,
Is it in a separate building or is it in the
yeah.
Okay,
So this is like where they live versus like where the business happens.
Okay. Well, I mean, he could simply say, I need to go to work.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, and then
Yeah.
Or to the factory or that kind of thing.
But you know, him saying work kind of belittles her because
Yeah.
I just finished telling you to do lady things and I'm gonna go to work.
I'm going to go do stuff that matters with my manliness here.
And you can't come.
And he's leaving her behind, right?
Yeah.
And then we do get, like, she's upset. She's rooted in the chair, holding back tears. It's the first time she'd cried in the study, and it washed away some of the happy times. I liked that feel, right? Mm-hmm. She's losing stuff. Other thoughts on this second half of the scene from anyone else who is desperately scrambling to read as we go? Christy.
It's very engaging.
Okay, go over to Christy.
Going back to the very beginning. You know, at the very beginning, I think it was Alyssa who said that you could pull the dialogue forward and then transition into the setup. I think we tend to default by setting the stage and then bringing the characters on. And when I see it flipped around, I think, oh, that works. Why don't I ever think of that? So this, you know, where this kind of introspective, she had not planned, blah, blah, blah. You can push that down 2-3 paragraphs after you've grabbed the reader by the throat with the in the moment dialogue and action. And it still works. It's just, as long as you place it carefully, it's just part of that. They're in the scene and then you kind of give just enough background and setup and then flow back into the action.
I'd be interested to open where she's paused outside the door. She, you know, there's certain smells that come with the study that makes her think of William. Then he opens the door to see her there. Then we're getting the thing, and then we're flashing back to where she's been and what she's been doing and get that introspection more at that time.
Yeah, bring the emotion up front rather than you've got the smell in here, but otherwise you're just kind of setting it up.
Yeah.
With her.
All right, I'm going to go over to Christy. You had a thought, Christy?
It's not so much just the second part. I mean, I think this is just so amazing, Jenny. It's fantastic. Huge project. But what really hits me, and of course I haven't read the whole thing, so I'm totally talking off the top of my head, but my question is, why Henrietta? Because to me, what seems the more interesting story is here you have Sarah Winchester, this woman of the 1880s, and then you have Ruth, a woman of the 1940s. To me, she seems more interesting and of the moment
And curious.
and curious. And so, although Henrietta is an important vehicle for Ruth to get information, she's the link to Sarah. I think, why Henrietta? Why not Ruth? And have it told, Ruth's trying to get this information. And she's kind of this modern woman of the day, acting in very similar ways, in some ways to Sarah, but in some ways very different. And there are things that she is allowed to do this. So that is the thing that just really
that's really interesting. Yeah, because I mean that works, because at the end she could be the one that discovers the real legacy, because it's the whole story is the lost legacy of Sarah Winchester, and
I think you've hit on it, Christy. That really resonates with me. I think having Ruth as the bookend point of view character really rattles the cage more. You know, instead of a reluctant narrator, you've got a really forceful one who wants answers.
Yeah.
Jenny's just like, holy shit, I got a major rewrite on my hands.
Yeah, that thought crossed my mind too.
That's what you get for bringing it to happy hour. Have a nice day.
But yeah, I think it works. I mean, Henrietta is a character in the, sorry.
Little cat butt perspective on that.
Body of the story, but I think that still works to not have her be the point of view character on the ends. So.
Well, because I think if you keep it at Henrietta, you run the risk of having almost 3 timelines going. So Sarah's perspective in the past, Henrietta's perspective in the past, and Henrietta's perspective in the 1940s.
Right.
If you keep it that Henrietta might still be around, but it's Ruth.
Right.
Again, you can see the scene like, grandmother never wanted to talk about this times, blah, blah, blah. She kind of maybe feels a little bad that she's pushed her grandma into doing this, but this is her chance to get this great story. And she's slowly uncovering that history versus she does not know it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of places, because some of what happens is that Ruth or Henrietta went to live with Sarah. She was kind of on the run because it sounds trite when I say it out loud, but her husband basically ended up in the insane asylum.
Yeah.
And then
Henrietta's husband.
Yeah, Henrietta's husband. And so this is like her big secret. And so, but she knows that all along, versus Ruth is able to react to learning that. Yeah.
In the story, does on Sarah's perspective, does she encounter Henrietta? Like, is that part of it?
Right. Henrietta is a real person, and she moved in with Sarah as sort of her companion and secretary, you know.
So you'll be showing that from Sarah's perspective. So then the secret will be there, and then we're kind of wondering if Ruth is going to find out about it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah. So way back when I started this story, the whole thing was going to be from Henrietta's point of view, until I found her like hanging around in corners and clinging from the walls, observing scenes. I was like, that's not going to work.
And Sarah is your driver at this point.
Right.
So I think that's very interesting. So I think Christy's going to get the gold laurel for most interesting thing to take us off in a new direction. I am aware that we have gone through a whole hour. So I do want to, respect that and keep that in mind. I want to thank Jenny hugely, because I know how freaky it is to share some initial pages. And just remind you again, Christy mentioned it, but this story is really compelling to me. Like, it's made me, like, I actually on my own looked up the Winchester house after, I'd heard something about it, but it wasn't until you started talking about it. And I think this story has a lot of commercial viability, because it's fascinating, and this tendency to think of women as crazy when they're doing stuff, I think is a very interesting and perhaps timely story to be told.
It struck me, yeah. So, well,
I'm
thank you
gonna-
everybody too. I know it's really hard sometimes to give feedback too, because you're in this place where we've gotten to know each other not well, and there's a trust element where you're telling somebody something really honest, and but you have this fear like, oh, are they going to hate me for what I've said? So I really appreciate everybody's like honesty and just feedback. And I took a lot of notes on my side, and obviously I can replay the office hours, but I think this was really valuable. Eileen, of course, but everybody, I know that's hard, and I appreciate everybody's honesty. And
I think this is a great use of our office hours. And as we're kind of developing and looking at how to use this time together, I can give a lecture on something, but I do think it's practical examples that really push it and allow people to kind of see things in their own work and then also in others' work. So I think we should do this again if other people are open to volunteering.
mm-hmm.
So on that note, I will remind people I'm going to be away for 2 weeks starting next week. So just so people know, I have set things up. So our very own Lisa, wave to the crowd, Lisa, is going to do a talk for us on Microsoft Word for writers and how that can be useful. And I've also asked Amanda, which I think some of you guys know, to talk to us a little bit about editing because she does that work.
Would anybody here actually find that topic word useful? Or will I be alone in the room?
You were breaking up there, but I think what you said, do people find that topic interesting or useful? So the topic was tips and techniques from Microsoft Word that can be useful for writers. Yeah, you're getting some thumbs up in case you can see it. I mean, I think it's an interesting thing where, we talk about Scrivener a lot, and a lot of people are huge fans of Scrivener, but there's also some benefit of understanding what Word can do for you, and I think we often don't know. So I think you will not be alone. So for people to keep an eye on, that will be in the schedule for you while I'm away. So I've kept you busy. And if there is someone who wants to volunteer to be next up on a happy hour with any specific question and some pages, then we can tackle that. So happy to do that. Or if it's like an outline, so if it's something around plotting, we can use an outline, or something like we did with Alyssa where we were talking about a character in particular and motivation. All right, well, I'm going to turn off the recording. I'm going to set people free. Have a good day. I will be around all this week. I don't leave until Monday, so if people have any questions, reach out. And otherwise, I'll see you around. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Have fun, Eileen.
I will.
Bye.